Hello, and thank you for joining our Signal Media webinar. I'm Diego Lage, Senior Reporter with Signal Media, and I'd like to welcome you to this online event featuring FCIA's Emerging Leaders Disruptive by Design panel entitled Developing a Zero Trust Architecture to Secure the Supply Chain. For those who might not know, AFCIA's emerging leaders are our members who are aged 40 or younger. I want to note, however, that our presenters are not here solely because of their age. They're here because of their thought leadership, expertise, and impressive experience in their respective fields. And they just happen to be younger than 40. You are in for a great session as our emerging leaders always have great perspectives on IT, AI, and cyber. This session has been approved for continuing education and is part of the continuing education channel dedicated to content curated from our recent TechNet Cyber event held in June. You will be able to review the 12 other on-demand sessions with your single registration. Please note that the opinions expressed in this webinar are of the presenters and are not to be construed as official or reflecting the views of FCI International. Now, I would like to introduce you to our moderator today, Andy Sauer. Andy is the CEO and co-founder of Sentinel Blue. His specialty focuses on zero trust, cloud security, scaling regulatory and technical compliance requirements for defense organizations, and aligning operational security to business and executive objectives. He is a strong advocate for cyber workforce development, a proponent of elevating women in leadership positions in cybersecurity, and supporter of the charitable organization, the Cyber Guild. Andy will introduce our other presenters and moderate the discussion. Andy, over to you.
Right on. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is the second time that we've convened this particular panel, and we're very hopeful that this time we'll get to get through it. There's a lot that we can discuss. As a basis, just as audience, we encourage questions throughout the panel. Our intention is to engage with you and be as interactive as we can. So please, if we're talking on topics and you have a question that you'd like us to address, throw it in the chat, throw it in the questions, and we'll happily address it. As a background, an audience that comes to a panel like this won't be surprised or taken aback by a statement I would make that the United States is in a state of cyber conflict. Whether it's with criminal gangs who have financial motivation or nation-state actors who have geopolitical aims, there is an active adversary who's constantly looking for exposures in our organizations, trying to compromise our information and impact our ability to execute on our missions. Our national supply chain presents a massive attack surface for these bad actors to exploit and wreak havoc. And now, as defenders of this attack surface, we look to innovative new ways to better defend against these emerging threats. And we have one potential answer in the implementation of zero trust architecture. The panel today is going to explore that potential and its many connected topics as we look to better equip each other in the fight ahead. Now, this panel includes a pretty diverse set of practitioners from large enterprise to small business who are all pretty uniquely suited to have this conversation. And it should be a conversation, as I said. We want this to be interactive. We look forward to your questions. First up, we got Ken Flowers. Ken serves as the National Guard Bureau Chief Technology Officer, where he drives technological innovation and advancement across the National Guard Bureau and its 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. In his 15 years of experience, it also includes private sector time, where he provided critical support to various military and defense clients, focusing on information system accreditation efforts, infrastructure modernization, and enterprise architecture development. Allison King is the Vice President of Government Affairs at Forescout Technologies, where she's responsible for the company's relationships with Congress and the executive branch, and she leads all legislative functions, federal policy, and strategic partnerships. She's been in federal service for more than a decade in roles that include Congress, the Department of the Navy, CISA, and the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Bailey Marshall is a cybersecurity professional and a U.S. Army veteran with experience managing cyber operations, information technology, and security analysis for the Department of Defense and joint agencies. She brings nearly a decade of practice directly managing network teams, planning and executing cyber operations, and developing security strategies in both the private and public sectors. And finally, we got Greg Tomczyk. He's a former professional baseball player turned cybersecurity coach who's worked with more than 250 world-renowned companies, including the likes of the very small American Airlines, Caterpillar, and Trinity Rail. Having built several seven-figure companies in his time, he now serves as CEO of Valor Cybersecurity and hosts the Connected Mindset live show, where his efforts focus on helping industry-leading executives and his community connect to the mindsets that enable them to build trust with themselves and others in life and in business. Now, this is a star-studded cast based on everything I just covered. It's also a phenomenal expert cast on the topic today, which is zero trust. As a background, I think we've all heard and seen zero trust in every marketing email we've probably received in the last 5 years. I think there's probably a lot of confusion or misnomers around zero trust. So we're going to open the panel with a response to the question, what is zero trust? How would you describe this concept of zero trust? And what are some of the key principles that support zero trust? Who wants to take it first? I'll pick if I have to. Ken's going. All right, Ken.
Greg had a great answer last time. Greg, I think you should kick it off.
Okay. I appreciate that, Ken. Andy, great introduction. Pleasure to be on this panel. Looking forward to diving in here. So the way that I look at zero trust and the way that I explain it to the executives that I work with in the various businesses that we serve is zero trust is really a framework and a standard to follow for folks. When you have any relationship, whether it's in our lives or with technology, you can't have zero trust completely. You have to have a certain level of trust that you've calculated. We really need to understand that a lot of these frameworks that the best practice practitioners are putting out there are looking at how do we minimize bad things from taking place. As Andy mentioned, we're in conflict. How do we kind of minimize that threat surface? And zero trust frameworks and standards are a very feasible way to do that. You have to understand who's in your environment, what they're getting access to, and how you can control the way that they're navigating through your environment. And to me, that's what zero trust is. And looking forward to diving in a layer deeper as we go forward.
Ken, I think you're right. That's a great opening salvo. But to the rest of the panelists, how would you describe the concept of zero trust? And tell me some of the principles that underline it.
Can I just concur with Greg and call it a day? No, but zero trust for the National Guard is a little different. We have to, number one, go off of what the DoD states zero trust is, the 7 pillars, the 45 underlying, the 100, just all these things. Then we have to wait for the Air Force to drop their implementation plan or their strategy, which they just did a couple of weeks ago. Then we have to watch for the Army to drop their strategy. We take those strategies, then we have to create something that's inclusive for the National Guard. And so when I say inclusive for the National Guard, we're talking headquarters. So say, hey, zero trust, we understand we have micro-segmentation, least privilege, etc. But due to the nature of how broad and vast the National Guard is and our threat vector, because we have 54 Joint Force Headquarters states, it makes it a little different when we try to talk about implementing zero trust. Because now we're saying, hey, states, we need to figure out how do we make you secure? How do we drop interoperability? How do we share that data in a more secure fashion? So as all these strategies are coming down and we're talking to industry, we're getting a better sense of how do we move forward. So I would say for the Guard, we're still in the baby steps, the baby phases of zero trust implementation. We are talking to the DoD CIO's Office of Zero Trust Portfolio Management. We are talking to industry such as yourselves, the SMEs. But again, that's why I'm so grateful to be a part of this panel, just so I can see how you all think about zero trust. Now I can take your knowledge and bring that back to the National Guard and the federal government as a whole.
Yeah, we're definitely going to explore, we're going to put you in the hot seat a little bit. We're definitely going to explore how zero trust can be adopted in an organization at the scale of yours. I operate largely in the SMB world, and zero trust can mean something very different to us down here versus you and your 54 constituent organizations that you have to wrangle. To Bailey and Allison, do you guys want to add anything around, what do we mean by zero trust? What is that concept for those who aren't entirely clear what's meant? Hey, Ali, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Agree with what's already been mentioned so far on this call, and thanks again for the opportunity to contribute. And so from a Forescout perspective, it's absolutely a framework that will allow you, from a holistic perspective, to buy down your risk. And so when I talk to members of Congress and folks across the executive branch, everybody's kind of running towards trying to check the box on Executive Order 14028, which is improving the nation's cybersecurity, which really, throws out the objective of having a zero trust architecture across the larger executive branch, and something that the legislative branch is also looking to implement and take on board. And so for me, it's important because it's the prerogative of a customer or client to be able to select the tools and services that they want to, invest in across their stack. But it's critical that there is a appreciation and understanding that it's not just the tools. Like, you can't buy your way out of this problem. It really is an investment across the right tools that are going to satisfy your requirements, the training for every single person that touches the network, and the continuous policies that are going to allow you to shape the behavior from a macro perspective that will put you in a much better security posture moving forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of really highly technical ways of thinking through zero trust. And I inherently don't like the term zero trust, because you inherently have to trust at minimum one thing. One thing has to be trusted, and the trust then expands from that. So it's a trust, and when you have an established connection between the inherent thing that you trust, and then maybe you're adding some pieces to the table, now you have to continually verify that those pieces that you're adding to your trust framework are still trustworthy. So for example, zero trust, let's do a house. Like, you have a security system on our houses. Most of us do. Whether, whatever security system that you use, you inherently trust your security system to keep your house secure. But I have a front door lock that has codes on it that I can program to allow my dog sitter to come in and walk the dogs. And when we're not home, we have our pet sitters and someone's that watch our house, and we give them door codes. Well, I have to build trust with my people that I'm allowing to give these door codes to. And then if something happens where maybe my dogs weren't fed, or they weren't walked, or I expected something from them where that didn't occur, now my trust has kind of backed off a little bit. And maybe I don't want to give that person that door code anymore because something happened where I've lost trust in that. And I still trust my security system to keep people out of my home. So zero trust is kind of like that, where it's like you have to inherently trust one singular system, and then you expand your verification of trusting other principles, but you can pull that trust back at any time. So I think that's something that we catch on. Oh, it's zero trust. Well, there is a tiny bit of trust that has to occur at one point. Then when there is more trust given, it is continuously verified.
Yeah, I think in the marketing roundtable, when they put together the concept, a little bit of trust didn't sound quite as good as zero trust, right? And zero trust is very, conceptually for me, it adds up and makes sense. Yes, we all understand that there has to be a starting point. That is what security is. It's just like a cascading, trust sequence of trusting different things. But that's a great way to bring it back down to ground. I've heard the phrase used in zero trust that we should assume compromise. Do we mean kind of the same thing? Zero trust and assume compromise, are those the same sort of concept, or they separate?
That's how I've heard it described, and that's what I've witnessed. Always assume compromise at every layer. Always assume somebody's credentials are not aligned with whoever submitted it. That's, I think, what Baby was talking about. You have to have some trust, but then you need to verify. And the phrase I always use for the past few years is trust but validate. That's what risk management is to me. So
Bailey hit on that too. Like, talk about some of the key principles of zero trust. A couple have been mentioned. Ken, you mentioned microsegmentation. Bailey mentioned continuous evaluation. What other, what other key principles or key concepts tie into a zero trust architecture?
Yeah, I think Bailey hit on it perfectly around monitoring. You have to have monitoring in place to know when somebody goes against the rules and kind of violates the trust that you've put into them. A lot of people look at networks nowadays as a weapon system. So how are people using them? Are they being monitored? Do you have the right access controls in place? Microsegmentation, that can really minimize the whole threat surface. So I think when we think about these foundational principles, it helps people have more confidence, but still verify. I think a lot of people, when they think about zero trust, they think about, I now have all the confidence in the world that nothing bad's going to happen. And that's not the case. It's really an ability to increase your confidence in what you put in place with these principles, and then monitor to see if things go against, those rules that you've set. And I think any network has rules, but a lot of companies don't really intentionally set those rules. Allison hit on it. They kind of think about, a vendor or a tool is going to just solve all the problems, and they have to think about what rules they need in their ecosystem to build the appropriate amount of trust they need to have that level of confidence that they're willing to, put out there, and kind of think about how they're mitigating risk in their favor and not just kind of overall in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. I think for the federal government, again, these are just my views. I think zero trust, our biggest threat is insider threat. The things we can't stop are, our vendors, our cloud service providers. They're going to always be attacked from the outside. But internally, I think once we understand people's attributes, we understand their patterns, zero trust helps us now figure out, okay, they're not accessing something that they're supposed to access. They're going outside of their scope. 6 months later, what are they really trying to get at? And it's supposed to cut them off. That's the beauty of, I think, from a federal perspective, it will hopefully not stop, but it will negate or decrease the attack surface from an insider threat perspective.
So go ahead, Bailey.
Oh, no, I was going to add on. So Ken said a really good comment, like when people, they're insider threats, that makes me think of one of the key components of zero trust is least privilege. When you do inherently give someone or something a bit of trust to operate within your ecosystem, you give them the baseline access of what they need. To go back to the house example, like I'm going to let my dog sitter in to go walk my dogs, but I'm not going to give them the combo to my safe to get my jewelry or something like that. They don't need that to do their job. And so you give them the least access or the least privilege possible to be able to do their job. And that's it. And that secures the more finite pieces of your security system. And so that's another key principle of zero trust.
And just to kind of like round it out from mine, because these are all, really great points that everyone's made for least privilege. And this is like a ha-ha joke, but, everybody's flying economy class, okay? We're all going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to be able to move around a lot, but we are going to, get to our destination. And so that's one thing that I often, tell members, and they get it immediately. But when you talk about insider threat, I also like to joke around and say, well, it's not zero trust, it's negative trust. And so the things that you build to keep the bad people out will also ensure that, will help to kind of buy down your risk internally, because unfortunately that's, part of the calculus that we need to take on board. And so I think that these are all important things. And just speaking from, investments in tools, moving ahead, there isn't a single tool that can do everything for you in this space. Like, that's really important. I know there's like enterprise licenses and all kinds of like jazz fingers around marketing, but there isn't a silver bullet solution. And so that's the consideration that everybody needs to kind of be aware of. And across the executive branch, there is also a desire to be able to say, check the box, I've done everything, this is a compliance drill. This is absolutely not a compliance drill. And so while there's certain decisions that you can make that will help you satisfy some of those requirements. It's just there's no easy button here. As we explore more questions on this panel, I think it's also important. Part of your zero trust is I've had departments and agencies say to me, "Oh, well, we'll be zero trust on our IT," and I'm like, "No, it's all endpoints. It's your IT, your IoT, and your OT, because there's no air gap if there ever was one. It just doesn't exist." And so being able to continuously have an asset inventory of everything that touches your network, and then be able to control those assets and assure those assets are things that are going to continuously be a challenge, but also an opportunity.
I think the term commiserate was used at some point, and we can all commiserate as cybersecurity folks. One, that executives tend to want an easy button, a checkbox. They just want to be told, we're zero trust. We did it. Mission accomplished. And we all know as practitioners, it's not an end state that can be really achieved. It's a working state that we sort of stay active with. I think.
Oh, and one final thing,
Good.
Andy. Sorry, I just completely remembered. We talked about like assumed breach. There's also the dark humor. If any of you have ever had the misfortune of owning a sailboat, or any boat for that matter, that everything's broken, you just don't know it yet. And so the posture I often like to tell the folks that I meet with is that, what are you going to do now? And so that planning, practicing, building that muscle memory is critical.
They say the two best days in a boat owner's life, the day they buy and the day they sell. Everything else is in between, gets pretty rough. But just anecdotally too, it's funny, we talk about products. We can commiserate that executives and folks want an easy solution. I think we can also commiserate that our service providers and our tool providers aren't helping us with their marketing, saying like, this is the panacea tool. Now, I use a tool that I love that is called Zero Trust. Cloudflare Zero Trust, great tool. Could we maybe come up with a name that doesn't suggest to everyone that I ever talk to about it, like this is a panacea type tool? So these are some of the challenges we have to deal in. The term attack surface has been used a couple times in describing sort of why we would implement zero trust. And go back to the intro to the panel, at a national level, the United States has a massive attack surface that we've clearly seen is increasingly being exposed and exploited by foreign adversaries, whether they're, again, criminally motivated or geopolitically motivated. And supply chain is another key concept that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. I'm curious, from your all's perspective, what are some of the critical aspects of our supply chain that are subject to attack where we're seeing this danger rise?
So I'll go ahead and jump in just because this is close to my heart and what I have focusing a lot on. So back in January, you had the 4 principal cyber directors testify on Volt Typhoon and the vulnerability of our 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States. So that spans from chemical to wastewater, transportation, nuclear, healthcare, food and ag, energy, DoD, dams, critical infrastructure, energy, a lot of stuff. So you have that, and these are things that Americans rely on every single day, 24/7. So any kind of disruption, whether it's malicious or there's like some problem with like a patch, which we have recently experienced. Anybody selling Delta the last couple of days felt that pain there. That exists, and you can't separate Volt Typhoon, a malicious actor, from the impacts that you even had occurring with the whole CrowdStrike Microsoft outage. And so being able to appreciate and understand where our critical dependencies are and where the systematically important entities or assets are sprinkled across these different sectors, and where, from a geographical perspective, how that impacts the economy is something that we need to have bigger conversations around. And in fact, NSM 22, which was an update from Presidential Directive 21, which established those critical infrastructure sectors, recognize the role of CISA, the role of NSA Cyber Command in providing timely input, and then also the need to be able to understand what these Sector 9 sectors used to be, Section 9, but now exist. And I'll give you the perfect example. So in the wake of 9/11, DHS was established, kind of like, hey, we need something, it's on the shelf, it's not ideal, but we're going to go with it because we had this like national emergency. And around that too, like in the days since like 9/11 happened and DHS was rolled out, the most important thing that the White House was working on was trying to get the stock exchange back up. So if you want to kind of reverse engineer this like terrible calamity, what would an actor, malicious actor have to attack, or where would we have some kind of compromise, internally that could impact these different key ports, stock exchanges, different facilities? These are things that we need to focus on. And again, I like to tell people that you can't separate Bolt Typhoon from this latest outage. And unfortunately, it really kind of shows you, even with like a great company like CrowdStrike, how incredibly fragile the system is. And so I think that puts more pressure on, I hate to use the word, it's another buzzword, but public-private partnerships to be able to understand, operationally speaking, how we can really make the right investments to ensure that when we recover, it doesn't take weeks, it takes minutes or hours. Thanks.
Yeah, Bailey, Allison kind of made me think of what you were saying earlier about needing a little bit of trust. The lock that a lot of companies had trust in was CrowdStrike, right? As like, hey, this is a key provider for us, a key source of security. And a lot of folks woke up with the surprise that their resilience assumed that there would never be a problem with CrowdStrike. And even CrowdStrike, who's a phenomenal company, is susceptible to this kind of thing, and you need to pull it into your strategy. As far as our supply chain goes, I mean, what's the general state of our supply chain's resilience in your all's perspective from what you're seeing? At a national scale, and then maybe even as a microcosm in the folks that you work with or who you advise or your institutions.
Yeah, I would say Colonial Pipeline is a good example of like the state of where we were, and it was kind of a wake-up call for everyone. And now to remember, Colonial Pipeline was the issue there was inherently weak passwords, and a password was leaked, and so there's a human element to this as well, even in Zero Trust. So we talk about, we can do everything to segment our networks. We can do everything to box down our technical pieces. But Zero Trust also implies that there's a human interaction with this technology as well. And so I think one of the biggest threats to our OT and ICS SCADA space is the human aspect. And so how do we get ourselves as a nation up to a point where we understand the principles of Zero Trust and the principles of what it takes to secure, and with panels like these and conversations continually had about what can we do to make things better, because we don't want to have another, major outage or another. And this one most recently with the CrowdStrike issue was global impact. But when it comes to our actual our supply chain, the way that we receive fuel, the way that we receive, say all of our rail systems go down. It's just, that could be a huge impact to, yes, it's inconvenient that now we're stuck in different locations because we can't fly because the systems are not working. Well, what happens when we all go without food because we can't get food from different places to different places? And now we're very reliant on how things are shipped, how things are processed. If a large company, a large supply company like Amazon or someone similar goes down, that could really affect how we actually function and live life. So the human interaction with a Zero Trust architecture is incredibly crucial as well.
So I have a question to Bailey, but to the panel. At what point do we introduce AI ML to take away that human factor? What point do we say Zero Trust plus? New buzzword, new buzzword.
Been coined here. You guys heard it first.
Yeah, I heard something the other day. It was it was human monitoring, expert verify, and I think we're moving to that type of place in a lot of businesses that are more advanced, like those OT type environments where they're starting to have that expert verify, but depend on technology systems to alleviate some of the burden of monitoring things continuously and watching the clicker go up and down for water levels. Like they're allowing computer systems to tell them when things are off. And I think that transition is going to be a huge benefit, but there's also some things that third, fourth level we need to think about. How do we wrangle back in the AI if they go haywire or if something bad happens? A lot of people have talked about that. One of the commanders actually at TechNet Cyber was talking about, I think he was Army Cyber, and he was talking about the concept of third and fourth order thinking. He mentioned his biggest obstacle in his 25 years of service was convincing other government leaders outside of the defense sector that this stuff is real and it can happen. But he mentioned that a lot of them think about just the first order. Like if it hasn't happened to them or they haven't seen it before, then it's never going to happen. And I think that's one of the main reasons I think that our supply chain security is somewhat lacking. There's a lot of smart people working on it. There's a lot of good things taking place. I don't want to put those efforts down, but there are links within the supply chain of people that don't care about the security of other people or even themselves. So that basically breaks the chain and makes, the whole supply mechanism that we depend on for that end product to be compromised. So I think until we're able to better incentivize good security and good protection, people are only feeling like they're just going to be demeaned when something bad happens. And, that's kind of like an ego battle that a lot of us are fighting when we go out and talk to these organizations, because if they haven't had it happen to them, they don't see that third and fourth order effect that could take place, that a lot of us on this panel are like, this is going to happen, and we want to help you avoid that, and do what's in your best interest. And if we're able to do that, you're going to thank us later. So it's kind of that, the supply chain's not quite where it needs to be, but I think we're moving in that right direction with certain regulations and business incentives by companies looking for companies that are more secure to do business with. So I think it's a great transition, a lot of positive things taking place, but I still think we have a lot of work to do.
I just want to real quick remind the audience, hey, there's a questions feature. We want you guys to join the conversation, so feel free to send stuff in. We'd be happy to address any questions that come up. At risk of courting controversy, which I guess would be my role as moderator, maybe you guys can't totally, be controversial, but the state of our supply chain has me amazingly concerned. I mean, it's just everywhere I look, everything that happens, you look at what happened with CrowdStrike, it just seems we're not resilient anywhere close to where we need to be. And Bailey, you kind of brought up something. There's a great quote that I always keep bouncing around my head, which is society's only ever 3 meals away from total collapse. Right. And how much dependency we now have at a national level for energy, for, core services, hospitals. I mean, now we're seeing attacks on all of that core life supporting infrastructure that we used to feel was kind of off limits, is now not just being targeted by criminal gangs, but we see foreign adversaries are actually impacting things like water service delivery, hospitals, etc. And the fact that we remain so poorly resilient, and the sort of changes that we're seeing seem, in my estimation, to be slow. Like we're not taking it seriously enough. And I've heard the quote, I think it came from the Department of the Navy at some point, said something along the lines of, it's probably just going to take a cyber Pearl Harbor for it to finally sink in. But I don't know what that has to look like when we've already seen several things that I would classify as cyber Pearl Harbors. We've already seen them, but it just doesn't seem like we're reacting appropriately. So I don't know what you guys think.
So Andy, nobody cares about cyber or security until something happens, and it sucks so bad. For me, I always try to preach at the top level of the government, they need to care more than we care at the lower level. Zero trust needs to be a company-wide concept or a company-wide framework, not just a CIO framework or a CISO framework. It needs to be baked into your organizational values. And I think for, again, government, since I am government, when we see a rotation of leaders every 4 years or what have you, it starts the cycle over. And even when you see your CIOs, they typically rotate every 2 to 3 years. So it's a repetitive process. And even if we have a cyber Pearl Harbor, here today, gone tomorrow, we're going to go back. What gets us the most bang for our buck? How can we bring the most money in? How can we bring the most value to our warfighter? Typically, it's always about, the weapons and things of that nature. They're not thinking about the back end frameworks that help protect us. And I think, and typically, our line budget is so minuscule compared to everything else. I think if we have those discussions at a higher level, then maybe they'll understand zero trust and the framework and protecting the supply chain a little better. But I don't have too much hope right now.
Allison, if I could give you last word on this, and then I want to move into implementing zero trust. But are you seeing at the macro level the seriousness increasing, the intensity increasing for real change and real focus on this in the way that we as practitioners would like to see?
So where you can really tell what people care about is in their budgets. And so across the board, I look at different departments and agencies, and sometimes it's hard to kind of like really drill into because there's a game that kind of goes on. You show people what they want to see, and then you hide everything else. But generally speaking, there's been a tremendous push, especially within the Biden-Harris administration, because again, we came off of COVID and then Colonial Pipeline, JBS. And then, of course, like Change Healthcare, which was like ferociously expensive, not just for the organizations that had to deal with that, but for the U.S. taxpayer, it was about $1 billion more expensive than we thought it was going to be. Members of Congress are aware that critical infrastructures in every single one of their districts, and everyone has some flavor or level of healthcare that they need to depend on. And so there has been a push across the board to find mechanisms to hold people responsible and really kind of leverage oversight of their budget to do so. And so I continue to think that this is going to be a really big deal, and it's bipartisan, which is great. So with the election a couple months away, which we all have to kind of like, sift through all of like the crazy communications and conversations around that. But no matter who's in office, there is going to be a focus on cybersecurity. It was in the RNC policy agenda. I anticipate that it will be in DNC as well. And if you were to jump back into, Vice President Harris's memoir that she put out last time she was running, Chapter 9, does focus on cybersecurity. She was a member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and then, of course, she was on the Senate Intel Committee. And so there's big push from election security, but also OT. And so that will continue to permeate, but I will tell you that, it's a challenge to create, a benchmark to build champions across the board in Congress. Like being able to, on the Senate side where, if you're 75, you're kind of like a sprightly person because they're on the over-index on the older side, and then on the House side, they're focused on everything. It's difficult, but the more incidents that we have that have real physical financial impacts, it certainly provides an opportunity for these folks to get sober and serious on what they need to do.
It's a frustrating way to have to learn, but if that's what it takes, that's ultimately what will force it. I want to transition us more toward some practicality around zero trust. A couple questions came in, so thank you guys for throwing questions in the chat. One person asks about, can we get a little more in depth on what the experience is and what's kind of going on behind the scenes when we've implemented zero trust, particularly around access? Their scenario is, can you describe what a typical GS11's experience would be when they come in, they're accessing a business application that they need to use all day. What sort of processes are going on in the background? What is the security operations team looking at and seeing what sort of controls are actually in place in that world? Bailey, I think maybe you might be a good first pass at this.
Yeah, that's right up my alley. So having been military previously and gone through the rigmarole, I understand exactly what it looks like when you log in with your CAT card online to your accounts. And so really the end user doesn't see too much. They're logging in, they're utilizing, and every organization is different. So let me preface that by saying that. But you're logging in as a user, you're accessing your information, your applications, your data is popping up, et cetera. On the back end, when you have, a zero trust architecture in a good practice, you'd have alerting that would notify, an analyst that something is occurring. And I mean, not in the sense of every single person logging in. Maybe every single person logging in is not that big of a deal, but if you've got a GS11 that's maybe logging in on Saturday at like 1:30 in the morning, maybe that's a little bit concerning to someone. So they might set up an alert to say, hey, did that person actually log in during that time? Is this an anomaly? Is this something that, something that happened that we needed that person in at that time? Or is this really outside of this work schedule? And is that something we need to investigate? And then there are other things too. If an application is utilized in an incorrect way, for example, if you're uploading files with extensions that shouldn't be, maybe there's restrictions on what you can and cannot download. Those kinds of things are what SOC analysts and the greater analyst as a whole on the back end are going to see, especially when it comes to a zero trust architecture, because there are several different pieces of zero trust. There's the proactive, the active, and the reactive. Whereas proactive, you're preparing to make sure that nobody has access to the things they shouldn't have. The active is those alerting and those notifications that say, hey, something's going on and that's not quite right. And then the reactive is obviously the incident response and the quick to respond to lessen downtime. In a nutshell, I think that's probably what you might be looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I think this person's looking for some better understanding of maybe why zero trust impacts them as a user the way it does, and what net benefits being gained by organizations by following these. I think for a lot of users, their perspective is security is getting in their way, and it feels unnecessary, and you guys are sort of like crippling our ability to do what we need to do. I think maybe some people are looking for understanding why it's important that we do what we do at a technical level. So I had another question come in. A hot topic in cybersecurity, which we've already talked about a little bit, is insider threat. And they bring up the scenario of Jack Teixeira, the National Guardsman, who very famously, sorry, Ken, I can put you totally in the hot seat here, but who very famously took classified information and used a popular social media type platform, chat platform called Discord, to share that. And the question is asked from our perspective, from your all's perspective, what went wrong there? And for an organization that is concerned about that same type of threat, what could be done to prevent that type of attack in the future? Maybe Ken, what's the National Guard doing?
I was hoping to avoid this so much. There's not too much I can share since that was a classified event. But essentially, like Bailey stated, somebody came in, least privilege was not implemented. They had access to things that we're not supposed to have access to. And I will say Tempest controls weren't applied properly. Not sure there's people in the crowd know what Tempest is, but it's, the detection of wireless devices. So there were a lot of red flags, a lot of failed controls from a managerial perspective to a technical perspective that led to this event, which is kind of why we need to implement zero trust. But also that plays into how do we implement zero trust for the Guard all the way down across the 54. Headquarters doesn't control the state. The mayor controls the state. Our commander, our tag, the adjutant general is actually a state employee as well as a federal employee. So it's like, how do we teeter on that line? Zero trust can be implemented at a federal level. It can be implemented at a state level. That's kind of what we're trying to figure out at the Guard level. how do we take our guidance and push it down successfully across the 54? So if somebody has an answer, please let me know. Type it in the chat. I would love to talk to you.
Well, panel, what, in that scenario or these types of scenarios, what other things can we be doing to prevent that type of insider threat from occurring?
Yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot of dynamics to it. I've had insider threat take place at my own company and companies I've been employed at in the past. And I think Zero Trust hits on a lot of the components that will help solve some of those issues, which are when somebody new comes in, enabling them and kind of forcing them to build trust in the ecosystem as opposed to giving them everything, access to everything, and then hoping that there will be trustworthy. If you build trust in an environment and you get some seniority, you start to prove your skills, you prove that you're trustworthy, you're not logging in past midnight when you don't need to. When you're doing things like that, you build trust with the organization, and then they give you more access to things to unleash you to do more types of work to get more benefit in the business or operational environment. I think that's a key point to Zero Trust, is starting with Zero Trust and then kind of building trust slowly over time, as opposed to making sure that they have access to everything they need to do their job and then having to pull things back. That's something that destroys trust with the individual, and then they feel like they have to go and lash out, steal data, steal information, unleash it to the wider population. And that's typically when I've seen these types of insider threats play out, is when that cat and mouse game starts and leadership's just like cut them off or fire them, or and then they don't communicate well to IT to say this person has proven to be untrustworthy. How do we handle this? And then it becomes an HR issue, and then there's a lot of things that take place. But you have to kind of build trust as opposed to have the trust and then pull back, and then you're like, I don't trust you any longer. That makes anybody feel weird, and then they want to sell the data to the highest bidder, and that's typically what happens. So I think it's a little bit of a leadership obstacle, a little bit of an HR obstacle, but I think if we communicate a little bit better and help and force them to kind of build trust with leadership, it's going to be a better outcome at the end of the day.
Yeah, Greg, I want to. So for the military, we have a mission. So we don't have that privilege to just gain that trust. That's kind of why we go through our vetting process. I think for what we could do better at is the vetting. Sort of like, the shooting to President Trump, and now they're trying to figure out his background. Maybe, they figured out the background prior to, they put him on some sort of list. Maybe we looked at his attributes. We could have, prevented that in a sense. Or, there's better examples. But I think there's more of a human element at that stage, really doing a more thorough background check. Review your social medias, review your discords. Not the typical, let me put your credit check in. Do you have any red flags that way? I think we need to do a little bit more in depth from an HR perspective. But I totally agree. I think from a organization perspective, I know a Fortune 500 company, that process would definitely work.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I mean, different operational environments demand different structures, but even for companies, we have to vet folks before coming in. Oftentimes when we're hiring, it's kind of a rushed hire, especially for high profile roles. So I think those vetting mechanisms, going back to Allison's point on public-private partnerships, like we can have vetting, standards that are established between the two to kind of help companies, minimize that insider threat risk. And I think everybody wins from that type of communication.
Yeah, it's really difficult to do that in a public sector setting when you've got a lot of very fresh faces coming out of, say, high school or college, and they're expected to do a job that requires a high level clearance right out the bat. And so I think something that could help is that not only is the, you can't always predict what a person is going to do, but having more training within your organizations for those around to explain how to identify an insider threat. It's the human element. And so perhaps something that allows others and enables others to identify that more easily so that some reporting can go on within the underlying underbelly of the organization rather than having to see it from the top down, which is very difficult for leaders to do, especially, whether it be public or private sector.
As a tying to this whole point around what went wrong and what needs to be done, what role does compliance and verification and assurance around controls play in preventing something like this? Anybody?
I think nobody likes compliance when it comes up because it sounds like people are putting heavy rules on us to say you can't do this, you can't do that. It feels like going back to public school where it's like you have to be in a line and you have to raise your one finger and you have to do things this way and stay in your little box. And most of us don't like to be in a box. But I think we all need rules, to go back to Bailey's point, rules to be able to see when somebody is violating our corporate morals and values, or our company's morals and values, organizations. And once you have those rules in place, you socialize them as a part of the hiring process. And then you kind of make sure that people agree with those, they match their personal values. And if they don't, you can typically tease out most of the individuals that don't agree, which may be that future insider threat actor. So I think if we have rules that are set intentionally, it can really help in that process. And you got to start with the first conversation you have with that person. When you meet them out in the networking event, like, here's what my company believes in. And if they're like, that's what I believe in as well, kind of starts the process there, as opposed to not communicating any of your values and then waiting till they get violated for some type of repercussion to take place.
Yeah, I would say a lot of vendors don't like me who work with the guard. So my background is risk management, having, DIACAP and RMF. And I've realized through my journey that it starts at the acquisition level. When most of our organizations purchase some sort of IT, I always say, hey, let us review this, because typically they don't add in that level of security into the entire performance work statement. We've actually had a couple recently that we've procured services from. They'll come to my organization saying, hey, can you help us, go to step XYZ? And I'm like, let me look at your statement of work. Review the statement of work, there's no security in there. So I don't know if others on this call are familiar with it, but FedRAMP is at the federal level. Well, the DoD has their own set of controls that you have to implement past the typical FedRAMP step. And so there's been a few times I've been close to cursed out by some engineers saying, hey, you're making us do more work. Typically a FedRAMP medium is for the government, an IL2, which is public. And I'm like, hey, we need to be an IL4, IL5. So that verification and compliance, that is huge for the federal government, especially when we're talking CUI and above type data, because data is what the government runs off of. So I think that's a huge thing, and something that hopefully through the acquisition process we can get better at.
So with the star-studded cast we have here, and some pretty rich resumes, I'm sure all of you are in positions where you can play the role of an advisor. And for our audience, they may be wondering, okay, if I might be bought into zero trust, I understand the attack surface reduction that needs to happen. I understand my role in the ecosystem, in the supply chain. I need to implement this and take it to my executives. When they move forward with a zero trust architecture, what kind of impact can they expect to have in their organization, whether it's positive or negative? Like, what is the lived experience that an organization can expect? Or if you're an executive and you're like, hey, I'm in, but tell me how this is going to impact my ability to execute on my mission.
So I'll go ahead and jump off on this. The conversation that we often have with different organizations on this topic is that if you think of what you need to accomplish, there's a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is complete security. At the other end of the spectrum is your ideal operating state where you have no risk you have nothing that is going to be an impediment for you to be able to hit, your KPIs, your objectives, everything that's going to make you profitable or successful, depending on, where you are. And so when you apply zero trust, you really are moving more and more towards the center, or, a few standard deviations closer to the security piece. And that just can make the day-to-day functions a little bit more challenging when people would, prefer not to have to do multi-factor authentication, not have to, really advocate and validate and get approval for having certain permissions and access to whether they're digital or physical elements they need to do their job. And so there's always going to be some level of heartburn, because there's going to be a group of people who don't believe that they have any onus on ensuring the safety and security of what's going on to the people who are, maybe in a little bit of a tinfoil hat, and they don't trust anything, and they really are never really satisfied with the investments and the level of requirements across the board to be able to kind of move out. And so there's always going to be a healthy balance, but we can absolutely see and understand that the threat landscape really has intensified. And you can see across the board, especially with these IoT devices. 2 years ago, Commerce Department, they had, a ban on like Huawei, ZTE getting into like our telecom. And, I've had researchers send me information and saying, hey, well, that should mean that we should have less of these devices connecting to our government networks, private sector networks. And the answer is no. There's actually like a 30% year over year increase. And you're like, well, how can that be? Well, a lot of it's white labeling. It's very difficult. And so there's more and more elements being added every single day that just makes things so much more difficult. And you will always have, a group of people on your left and your right who will advocate for certain things and really protest against the others. But, this is our new normal, and this is what we have to be able to put into place to ensure that we can achieve the mission or we can hit our objectives. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of friction takes place. That's one of the unique roles that myself and my company get to play, is kind of be that architecture to lay things out before the implementation takes place. And when you can tease out some of those points that you mentioned, Allison, that may happen due to zero trust being implemented, it allows people to make a more calculated, decision at the end of the day. Is this really right for us? A lot of people, they get on their high horse, especially kind of leaders, executives, when they know they need to do something and they want to be the person to lead the charge. And zero trust is one of those types of initiatives, because they like the thought of nothing's ever going to go wrong because we've restricted it down to a point where we've minimized all the risk. And that's not a realistic situation. At the end of the day, I think about my experience as a conflict mediator in elementary school. Like, it's such a relevant role to be able to play, especially when you talk about these more technical topics, because you have the user, you have the IT leaders, then you have leadership, and they all want something different. So they have to, come to a middle ground. And a lot of that is roles and responsibilities are clearly identified. Most of the time when rollouts of these natures take place, there's not really clear roles and responsibilities. And I think when you can assign somebody to a specific responsibility, when it comes to implementing zero trust and the obstacles that are going to come up, oftentimes it gets smoothed out and really helps in the process. So I encourage, anybody that's going out and implementing zero trust or has already implemented it to kind of rethink about, what those roles and responsibilities are when it comes to upholding the standard and framework that you're going forward to implement.
Yeah, and everybody likes to talk about the bads of, hey, it's going to affect user capabilities to be able to do their jobs. People are going to slow down. I actually personally have seen zero trust actually helps businesses become more agile because there's a flexibility to move to cloud environments, remote environments. Not everything is stuck on one, on-prem system. And so zero trust does allow businesses to be more agile. And this is especially good for small businesses. that thrive on the ability to flex and move their operations from one project to the next. And so, there are benefits to Zero Trust too in terms of the user experience.
I think that's a huge point. Good security is a result of good engineering, and good engineering creates efficiency, right? And I think to a T, every company that I've participated in helping mature their security program, it's mostly been digital transformation that we're supporting. Right? It's just adopting modern IT engineering concepts at its core. And I think that's dead on. Those who are concerned and have issues with things getting tightened down when it comes to implementing security, it's often a net benefit. You just got to get through some of the immediate bumps and get through the political battles and whatnot around it, but a net benefit, all said. We're reaching the end of our hour here, folks. I want to open up to the panel for some final thoughts. As folks in the audience go to implement Zero Trust or communicate about it, try to increase security posture in their own organizations. You guys have any parting wisdom, parting advice for folks in that position?
I guess I'll kick it off, and this is pretty generic, but be coachable, right? You're not going to have all the answers. Other folks have, experiences, insights that might be valuable to you. Zero Trust will look, different for everybody in execution. Of course, you'll have the pillars and, requirements that are really going to amplify your security posture, but don't think that this is something that you have to do on your own or in a silo. There's definitely resources available. And so I encourage, anybody who's in this position, whether you're an administrator trying to create something, you're an engineer, or you're in a policy shop, or you're an operator, is to, take an interest in contributing to the solution. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll say from a government perspective, just be patient. We operate slower than molasses. I think one of the things that we wanted to touch upon, but we didn't get a chance to, was just the procurement process. From a government perspective, we're already palming for FY26 when we know we have to have this implemented by FY27. So let's talk about, hey, where do we divest expenditures from? How do we get more money, knowing that it's hard since the defense budget keeps getting cut, especially when we talked about, Allison, we were mentioning the line items. How much money will go towards IT. So just patience as we roll this out, as we build our strategy. And as Allison stated, there are a lot of, from a government perspective, if you go on the Zero Trust, the DoD Zero Trust portfolio management website, there are a lot of trainings. Just become familiar with it at different levels. So I think just being patient and becoming familiar and just seeing where you can be a value added is the first step and the best step.
Yeah, with any advancement and any societal change like technology, I think we all just need to recognize that everybody at the table has their own internal biases. They all have different experiences with technology, different ways they look at utilizing it, protecting it. So I think just going back to Allison's point, being open-minded, being willing to communicate and not get up in arms when things are against what you believe is going to really benefit a lot of people when they go to implement these types of standards. And I think the more people in the supply chain that get further up the chain of Zero Trust and supply chain security, we're all going to win at the end of the day from that. And I think we're going to be a more protected nation and a more protected community that we all live in.
Yeah, and people talk about it's very expensive to implement Zero Trust. Well, in reality, thinking a little bit different, when you identify the products that you can't implement into your structure, really Zero Trust becomes more cost efficient because you're removing things that you don't need in your systems and replacing them with things that are efficient and are going to save you more money in the long run. So you don't have multiple things that don't do what they're supposed to do and don't fall within your architecture. Now you have 2 or 3 good products that you have in your Zero Trust architecture, and that inevitably ends up saving you money in the end.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, panel, Bailey, Greg, Ken, Allison. That wraps us up. Audience, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, AFCEA and Signal Media, for putting this on. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully everyone got something valuable out of it. Best of luck out there. We're all kind of in the fight together. So AFCEA folks, we'll pass it over to you, and thank you all again.